G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. In this video, I'm going to talk through a fairly fast drawing in ink of the Dome of St Paul's in London. This took me about 50 minutes to draw in real time. As with anything that's symmetrical, it's important to work out where the centre is and how that lines up with the details that you're going to draw. And in this case, I'm starting to draw with the lower drum and particularly the colonnade that stretches across it. And I work out that the center point is in that gap between the two columns just to the right of that sculpture niche that doesn't have a sculpture in it. And that center point goes right up through the dome and to the top of the lantern. Because I'm not looking exactly straight onto the dome, there is a slight curve on the top of the drum. I start drawing this with too much curve, but I'm able to adjust it later without any problem, I don't think. If at all possible, don't leave a line that's not quite right. Adjustments usually aren't as obvious as if we leave the problem line there. I also count the columns. It's important to get this as accurate as possible. While I can approximate them, I find it usually works best to try and fit in the actual number that are there, because I do want it to look like there's as much on the left-hand side as on the right-hand side. While my adjustment on the curve looks a little bit clumsy here, I do manage to, I think, disguise it more as the drawing goes on. And so then I draw also the lines for the entablature, but also the line for the top of the balustrade that sits on top of the lower drum. Now I add the details of the columns. I put the Corinthian capitals on and align the tops of the columns, and I also put the column bases on. Again, I have the second drum, which is narrower than the first, and I spend a fair bit of time working out how wide it needs to be to keep the proportions the same. I think, if I'm honest, I draw this second drum slightly higher than it really is, but I also work out how these pilasters, these square columns that are actually attached to the side of the drum, how many they're meant to be and how they align with what's under it. And I do that, and it tells me that I haven't quite drawn the drum wide enough. So I do make a slight adjustment to that later as well. You can see here my method of lining up the tops and bottoms of these windows. I actually draw the horizontal lines ahead of the vertical ones, because the most important thing is that there is that line fitting into the circular perspective that goes up with the drums. Notice that even with a pen we can get a lighter line, and I'm also practicing the curve before I actually put the pen on the paper. Getting these curves right, getting the dome the right height above the drum is always a challenge, and the only way to learn how to do it is to do it and to look critically at what we've done afterwards and work out, okay, if I make a mistake a certain way, what direction is that? Do I make my domes too flat and squashed? Do I make them too tall? I tend to make mine too tall, so I try and compensate for that. I'm feeling like the dome isn't quite as large or as full as it should be, and so I do a very slight adjustment with the lines on the outer curves of the dome later. And then I need to position the base of the lantern. So because I'm getting close to drawing the lantern, I need to check my alignment of the center line, because nothing's worse than a lantern that doesn't look on center, or it looks like it's leaning in one direction. So there's a fair bit of fiddling around for that. Now here I just add a little bit extra bulk to my dome because I felt it just didn't look quite large enough. So I'm happier with how that sits now. And again, a few adjustments just to hide the fact that I've made that. And now the lantern. With the lantern, I don't particularly try and draw the shape. I'm drawing more the shadows, because the shadows suggest the architecture quite nicely. So I position the shadows first, because that's the thing that lines up on the center line, and then I just work out how wide I want the lantern to go. Observation is very important with the lanterns. We don't want them too large because then they overbalance, overpower the dome, make the dome look smaller than it really is. But we also don't want to make them too tiny and shrimpy because then they look a bit unbalanced. A few more details on the upper dome, and then a little work on the balustrade. Putting the balusters in. And just a tiny suggestion of their real shape is all that's needed. And now I've got the structure that's behind the colonnade, which is also being highlighted by the shadows that are cast. It's best to stay fairly loose and suggestive with these details. Try and draw too much detail and it's going to end up looking a bit overdone and even be more obvious than the columns that are meant to sit in front. Now, at this point, I'm thinking I'm going to do this drawing completely in line, and so I do hatching to indicate the shaded areas. But in a moment, as I finish the hatching, I decide that since I had my sketch markers all around me, I might as well use them to add some more tone. So here's the completed line drawing. What would you do? Would you have added the tone or would you leave it as a line drawing? Well, here comes the tone, so you can decide that yourself. I'm using Copic sketch markers, neutral grey colour. I'm using the N0 to the N4, which are the 4 lightest tones of neutral grey. And they let me certainly strengthen the shadows between the columns and also to indicate the shade that's on the lower drum columns on the right hand side, which were a bit hard to do with line alone. And I also add some local colour onto the dome to give it a very light grey, just to reflect the fact that it is a slightly different colour to the rest. What do you think?